Street Fighter 2. You know that one, right? It's only one of the most famous and influential arcade fighting games of all time. To say that this game was a global phenomenon would be nothing short of an understatement. Street Fighter 2 is a timeless classic and simply awesome. But there's one aspect of Street Fighter 2 that continues to confuse people to this very day. That's right, I'm talking about all those different editions. While it's true that Capcom has been heavy-handed with all the different editions and ports of Street Fighter 2, I still feel like there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the subject. So today I'll be chronicling the evolution of Street Fighter 2 and doing my best to break it down into easily digestible chunks so hopefully people can understand it better. And yes, we're just covering Street Fighter 2. The other sub-series are much less complicated, and we would be here all day if we delved into the Street Fighter timeline and lore. There's a lot of ground to cover though, so strap yourselves in, it's time to hit the streets! Let's go back to where it all began, all the way back in 1991 with Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior. Designed for the Capcom PlaySystem arcade platform, Street Fighter 2 revolutionized the fighting game genre with its smooth gameplay and a brand new combo system. Yeah, it's hard to believe nowadays, but there was a time when fighting games lacked combos. Previously, fighting games were much more stiff, but come 1991, games like Street Fighter 2 as well as SNK's Fatal Fury were out here pushing the genre to new heights, with Street Fighter 2 in particular focusing heavily on combos. But apparently, this wasn't originally the developer's intent. The story goes that the concept of combos came about more or less by accident. It just so happens that players found certain moves flowed naturally into others, and it ended up working so well that they adopted it as a standard feature going forward. This combo-based style of gameplay turned out to be a massive hit and spawned countless imitators over the years, setting the stage for the fighting game genre as we know it. But how does Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior hold up? Compared to recent entries, though par for the course for subsequent sequels and reboots, the roster is quite small, with only 8 playable characters to begin with. Ryu and Ken return from the first game and are joined by a diverse cast of characters from all over the world: E Honda, Chun-Li, Blanca, Zangief, Guile, and Dhalsim. Of note is Chun-Li, who is commonly regarded as one of the first female characters in a fighting game and has become equally as iconic as Ryu and Ken. As you fly around the world defeating everyone as the fighter of your choice, you soon come up against the Grandmasters, starting with Balrog, moving on to Vega, and then you come up against the final boss from the first game, Sagat. And you're like, okay, this is the final boss, right? Nope, because we have M. Bison. But wait, are those really their names? Okay, so the naming convention here is a bit messy. Originally, these characters were called M. Bison, Balrog, and Vega. However, to avoid any potential issues with likeness infringement between M. Bison and real-life boxer Mike Tyson, the characters were renamed in the international releases. Due to how late into development this decision was made, it was too late to create new graphics and audio, so the character names were simply rotated around. Boxer Guy became Balrog, Claw Guy became Vega, and Dictator Guy became M. Bison. You'll often see these characters referred to as Boxer, Claw, and Dictator in the worldwide competitive scene to eliminate confusion, but for the sake of this video, I'll be using their international names. Got all that? Cool. Following the success of the arcade cabinet, a home release quickly followed in 1992 with Street Fighter 2 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Super NES, SNES, NES, NES, Super Nintendo, these are all largely regional terms and they're all valid, okay? This is the original home version of Street Fighter 2, and a significant factor in this game's explosive popularity. Street Fighter 2 for the Super Nintendo was a massive hit, going on to become one of the best-selling titles on the system, with a staggering 6.3 million copies worldwide. But how does it compare to the arcade original? For the time, quite favorably. The Super Nintendo isn't quite as powerful as the Capcom Play system, so concessions needed to be made to the graphics and audio. A bunch of voice clips and some special stages are missing, presumably due to storage constraints, but despite its limitations, this is still the Street Fighter 2 you know and love. Meanwhile, back in arcade, Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior was followed up in 1992 with Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, and later that year was followed up again with Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. So what makes these versions different? In Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, the roster was expanded with 4 Grandmasters now available as playable fighters. Mirror matches, that is, matches between the same character, are now possible for the first time, with palette swaps differentiating between player 1 and player 2. Several graphical elements were improved or redone, and changes to each character's moveset were made in order to improve the game's balance. This was also the first in several steps to make Ryu and Ken functionally distinct characters instead of simply clones of each other. Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting, also known as Street Fighter II Turbo, refines things further. Released later that same year as an upgrade kit for Champion Edition boards, Hyper Fighting primarily features faster gameplay than previous editions. Additionally, most characters were given at least one new super move, sorry Guile, and most characters also received new color palettes, with the original colors available as their alternate palette. Naturally, these upgrades made their way over to the home consoles, with 1993 seeing the release of these new editions of Street Fighter II on various platforms. The Super Nintendo of course saw the release of Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting in July of 93, August 93 internationally, which also featured Champion Edition as an alternate mode. This port added additional voice clips in the barrel breaking minigame that were originally missing from the previous version. Meanwhile, over on Team Sega, fans of the Mega Drive finally got a piece of the action too, with something truly special. Released a few months after the Super Nintendo version, September 93 in Japan, North America, and October 93 in Europe and Australia, with support for the brand new 6-button controller, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition was originally intended to be a port of Champion Edition, but was delayed a few months in order to add content from Hyper Fighting, much like the Super Nintendo version. In fact, aside from audio and graphical differences due to the different hardware, these versions are largely identical. Nevertheless, there was plenty of debate over which system had the better version of Street Fighter. Which do you prefer? Japanese gamers also saw a third option, with Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the PC Engine. Released in June of 1993, predating both the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions. Like the ports for rival platforms that would soon follow, this port is much more accurate than the original Super Nintendo version, sporting the barrel breaking minigame and additional voice clips, and like the Mega Drive version, this game was released along a brand new 6-button controller designed primarily for this game. Here's how it compares with the others. At this point, and in the years to follow, there were several other ports to game systems and home computers, such as the Sharp X68000 version, which was nearly identical to the arcade cabinet. Fun fact, Capcom actually used this amazing computer to develop several of their arcade titles throughout the late 80s and early 90s. Other curiosities include the Game Boy and Master System ports, and the licensed adaptations for various European computers. For brevity's sake, I won't go over everything, but if you had a device that could play games, rest assured that you would be able to get some form of Street Fighter II on it. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Street Fighter II continued to evolve in arcades, and in 1993, Capcom took things to the next level. Making the jump to Capcom's next generation Capcom Play System 2 hardware. Super Street Fighter 2, the new challenges, features more special moves, improved graphics and audio, and of course, 4 new playable characters, bumping the character roster from 12 to 16. Joining the battle are Indigenous Warrior T-Hawk, Special Forces Agent Cammy, Hong Kong movie star Fei Long, and kickboxing musician DJ, each bringing new fighting styles into the mix. Existing characters were also once again given new moves, with Ken for instance getting this cool flaming Shoryuken. New selectable color palettes were added. However, one feature that didn't return was the faster game speed from Hyper Fighting. Along with Super Street Fighter 2 came its own series of home ports the following year, starting with versions for the Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive. By 1994, both of these systems were starting to show their age, and more powerful successes were already on the horizon. Nonetheless, the humble 16-bit systems punched well above their weight, with Super Street Fighter 2 being printed on the highest capacity cartridges either system had ever seen, a massive cartridge for a massive game. Even more than before, these ports are largely identical to each other, but there's the usual pros and cons for each version, and despite the gulf in hardware capabilities between the arcade and home platforms, the game still manages to come across excellently. Yeah, okay, so that makes 3 Super Nintendo versions of Street Fighter 2 overall. One new version every year for 3 years. I can see how this may have had a negative impact on people. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Street Fighter 2 was the hottest thing in town, and home consoles needed to stay ahead of the curve. Maybe it was easier to justify in arcades than at home, but it's not as if online updates were a thing on consoles in 1994. Various home computer ports were also released in 1994 for the X68000, FM Towns, and IBM PC compatible systems. Like the previous release, the X68000 version was the premium option that offered Japanese gamers the closest experience to arcades, while the FM Towns version offers a CD quality arranged soundtrack. Not out of the ring just yet, Super Street Fighter 2 would return to arcades in 1994 for one final bout. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, known in Japan as Super Street Fighter 2 X, is the ultimate version of Street Fighter 2 that's still played competitively to this day. True to its namesake, the turbo speed modes from Hyper Fighting make their return, with several speed settings allowing the player to tune the game to their liking. Also new is the addition of super combos, powerful automatic combos that can be unleashed after filling the super gauge at the bottom of the screen, allowing the player to greatly turn the tide of battle. By 1994, other popular fighting games such as Mortal Kombat and Samurai Showdown were offering powerful finishing moves, and super combos offer a unique Street Fighter take on this concept. But the changes don't end there. More so than any other revision before it, many characters receive not only new special moves, but new regular moves and air attacks, and new animation frames for their existing attacks. Super Turbo is by no means a shining example of fighting game balance. This was early days after all, but all the gaps and inequalities were greatly closed in this release. Remember how I said there were 16 characters in this game? Well, actually, it doesn't end there. Allow me to explain. If you manage to do a perfect run of the arcade mode, the final boss battle features a new challenger, Akuma, or Goki in Japan. This is the mysterious figure you see in the game's intro. Akuma is basically a souped-up version of Ryu and Ken, and is stronger and faster than any other character in the game. Definitely the boss character to end all boss characters. Using a secret code on the character select screen, you can also select Akuma as a playable character. However, he is way too powerful for serious play, and is more of a cheat than anything else. But that's not the only secret this game holds. By holding start before selecting a character, you can play as their iteration from new challengers, effectively doubling this game's roster from 16 characters to 32. While you do lose the super gauge while playing as these versions of the characters, any balance changes made in Super Turbo are also reverted, which for certain characters could actually be beneficial. The official competitive tier list for Super Turbo takes this into account. Meanwhile, for the home player, a new generation of console gaming means a new generation of home ports. These are all superficially similar to the arcade counterpart with relatively minor downgrades, but they're all still worth talking about. The first of these was the port for the 3DO consoles, released in the tail end of 1994. Billed as a system seller, this port was incredibly impressive for the time, but its limitations are more apparent when held to closer scrutiny. Reduced animation frames, no parallax scrolling, and loading times all start to add up, especially if stuck with the standard 3DO controller. Yet despite all that, it still plays great, and manages to run at a near flawless 60 frames per second, quite the rare feat on 3DO, making it stand as the best way to play Super Turbo at home for quite some time, provided you were one of the few people who could afford a 3DO anyway. A few years later in 1997, PlayStation and Sega Saturn finally got a slice of the action with the Street Fighter Collection, a 3-game compilation featuring both Super and Super Turbo, as well as an upgraded version of the previous year's Street Fighter Alpha 2, titled Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. The ports of both versions of Super Street Fighter 2 are based closely on their CPS2 arcade counterparts, which compared to the 3DO port feature only minor differences such as loading times between matches and reduced animation frames here and there. If you can get around the frequent loading times, this is a solid version of both Super and Super Turbo. Finally, Sega Dreamcast received a port of Super Turbo, released exclusively in Japan via Capcom's mail order service on December 22, 2000. This port marks the return of special stages, which were previously missing from Super Turbo, and was the first version of the game to officially support online play. Whew, okay, we're finally done. Yep, as far as classic Street Fighter 2 goes, that's it. 5 arcade versions, a few special console versions, not so confusing after all, right? So to quickly review, Street Fighter II The World Warrior debuted in 1991 as the original version of Street Fighter II. It was soon followed up by Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting, each bringing notable features and gameplay improvements that would become standard for the series. Super Street Fighter II The New Challenges marks the jump to fancier arcade hardware and introduces several new characters, and Super Street Fighter II Turbo refines things further, becoming the competitive standard for decades to come. It might seem absurd to the home console gamer to have so many versions of Street Fighter II, but yearly refreshes made sense in the arcade scene. Think of it as being similar to seasonal content updates for service-based multiplayer games nowadays, and it starts to make a little more sense. Now don't panic, but there's still a few more games we need to talk about, and some of them are crucial parts of Street Fighter II's history. The 5 arcade editions of Street Fighter II would go on to be included in various collections and compilations over the years. Most of these releases don't bring anything new or notable over the arcade originals, but there were a few special remixed versions of Street Fighter II over the years. Over the 2000s, several updated versions of Street Fighter II were released, each billing themselves as a revival for the series. The first of these was the appropriately titled Street Fighter II Turbo Revival, released in 2001 for the Game Boy Advance. Unlike previous portable outings, this was the real deal. It's very close to the arcade version of Super Turbo. Not bad for a handheld of the era. Right away you'll notice that the menus and UI elements are updated to look closer to something like Street Fighter Alpha 3. It's likely that this was done to give the game a more modern look and feel, but in execution the results aren't that great. Graphic design is my passion. Another notable difference is the revamped stage backgrounds. Some are similar to the originals, a couple are lifted out of the Street Fighter Alpha series, and 5 of them are completely new. Some of the voice clips are different, Akuma has a super combo where he didn't originally, and you can even look Shin Akuma, the boss version of Akuma normally fought in arcade mode. Other than that, it's not substantially different from the original as far as I can tell. Next up is Hyper Street Fighter II, the Anniversary Edition. Released in arcades and on PlayStation 2 in 2003. Like Super Turbo before it, this runs on the CPS2 arcade platform and is closely based on its predecessor. What sets Hyper apart and makes it worthy of the Anniversary title is the fact that it doesn't just include Super and Super Turbo character variants, it includes everything. World Warrior, Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting, New Challenges, Super Turbo, everyone is here! Finally you can see which variations of which characters are the strongest. Want to relive Ryo's sexy stubble phase? You can do that. Hyper Street Fighter II's PS2 port, released standalone in Japan and Europe and bundled in the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection in North America, comes with a few additional features, such as the option to choose between the arranged soundtrack, the original CPS2 music, and even CPS1 style. You can listen to all these soundtracks in the gallery, as well as view the intros and endings to all the classic games. As an added bonus, also included is Street Fighter II The Animated Movie. This version was also released on the original Xbox as Street Fighter Anniversary Collection in all regions. Hyper Street Fighter II is mostly a novelty these days, but I still think it's really cool. If you get the chance to play it, it's definitely worth revisiting. Throughout the late 90s to mid 2000s, as 3D technology matured, 2D fighters had begun to fall out of fashion, with 3D fighting game series like Tekken and Soul Calibur surging in popularity. All the 2D giants made the jump to 3D to try and stay relevant, sometimes with mixed results to say the least, and Street Fighter was no exception. Despite their attempts to innovate, Street Fighter struggled to stay relevant throughout the 2000s, but just as all hope appeared to be lost, a revolution happened. Xbox 360 kickstarted the new console generation in 2005, with PlayStation and Nintendo quickly following suit the following year, and the hot new feature was Xbox Live Arcade. No longer did you have to rely on compilation discs to get your arcade gaming fix at home. Now you can just download your favorite classics over the internet for a low price. It's easy to take digital distribution for granted nowadays, but back then it was a huge deal. All the arcade giants of old wasted no time jumping on board with emulated ports of classic arcade games. Even Street Fighter II was available. However, that was just the beginning. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, don't laugh, I'm serious, was released in November 2008 on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. Sporting brand new HD visuals from the artists at Udon and a swanky new soundtrack from Overclocked Remix and featuring online play, this is Street Fighter 2 for the new age. Balance adjustments were made to the roster to level the playing field between characters, though you also have the option to revert to Super Turbo style if arcade perfection is your thing. HD Remix may be light on extra content, but it was a massive hit, breaking sales chart records at Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. On the back of the success of HD Remix and the earlier XBLA port of Hyper Fighting, Street Fighter was big again for the first time in almost 10 years, paving the way to the creation of the massively successful Street Fighter 4. In some territories, HD Remix saw a physical release on Xbox 360 in the form of Capcom Digital Collection, a bundle of 8 great Capcom XBLA games. Oh snap, is that Puzzle Fighter? This is a Puzzle Fighter video now. Almost a decade after HD Remix, Street Fighter 2 returned once more with Ultra Street Fighter 2, The Final Challenges. Final, huh? I'll believe it when I see it. While this may seem superficially similar to HD Remix and share some graphical elements, it's actually rebuilt from the ground up. Graphics, music, and sound effects are revamped, but the originals from Super Turbo are available too. However, this isn't merely an update of Super Turbo, it's a whole new edition of Street Fighter 2, sporting the usual balance adjustments along with 2 new characters, or newish anyway, Evil Ryu and Violent Ken. Evil Ryu debuted in the Street Fighter Alpha series as a sort of what-if story for Ryu. This is Ryu if he gave into the power of the Satsui no Hado after the events of Street Fighter 1. He's basically a combination of Ryu and Akuma. Violent Ken is an interesting one, as he hails not from Street Fighter, but from SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos, initially released by SNK on the Neo Geo MVS arcade platform in 2003. This is Ken after being brainwashed and taken control of by M. Bison's Psycho Power, inspired by a similar event in Street Fighter 2, the animated movie. Yeah, okay, so despite the new movesets, they're basically just cheap recolors of Ryu and Ken, so calling them new characters is stretching things a little. But they are what they are. Hardly necessary, but still pretty cool. Look, I've covered enough versions of this game already, so there's not much else left to have to say. It's Street Fighter 2. Did you really expect anything more? Way of the Hado!
The Rising Dragon.
Okay, this is getting too complicated. Turbo this, Revival that, HD Remix, Puzzle Fighter, Way of the Hado. I hear you. You don't want frills, you just want Street Fighter 2. What's the best way to play it nowadays? Honestly, some of those original console ports still hold up decently. The SNES Classic is a solid option. If it's arcade perfection you want, a properly configured MAME or Final Burn setup works wonders, even if setup can be a hassle. However, these options aren't that convenient for most people. In terms of convenience, the best way to experience Street Fighter 2's legacy today is another Street Fighter game! This is the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, released in 2018 for Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and PC. This is a collection of 12, yes, 12 arcade versions of Street Fighter, including the 5 versions of Street Fighter 2, the Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter 3 trilogies, and even the original Street Fighter. This collection was put together by the skilled video game preservationists at Digital Eclipse, so not only is the emulation solid, but there's a ton of great museum content. There's even online play for select titles. If you want to experience the legacy of Street Fighter 2, maybe even check out where the series went afterwards, Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection is definitely worth your time. Roses are red, violets are blue. I played 22 versions of Street Fighter 2. Finally, we've reached the end of this adventure. This video was a long time coming, and I almost thought it wouldn't see the light of day, but after numerous delays, we've finally done it! Through the arcade hits of the 90s, the revivals of the aughts, and the legacy going forward, I hope I've managed to clear any confusion about Street Fighter 2 and its numerous updates. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that's it for now. If you want to support my channel and other creative endeavors, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Every little bit helps me produce more videos like this one. Or you can simply like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, or check out some of these other great videos. There's no shortage of fighting game related content on my channel, so I hope you stick around. Thank you everyone for watching, and remember, you must defeat Shenlong to stand a chance.